In the Nazi worldview, America was a culturally bankrupt nation, a mongrel society poisoned by Jewish influence and black culture. Films, posters, and radio broadcasts depicted Americans as weak, decadent, and obsessed with money, but also as brutal gangsters and sadists. Soldiers like Klaus were told that if captured by the Americans, they would face horrific torture for information. Their captors, they were assured, had no honor and viewed the German soldier not as a professional adversary but as a Nazi beast to be exterminated. This narrative served a dual purpose. It fueled the German soldier's will to fight to the death, making surrender seem like a fate worse than annihilation, and it justified the Reich's own barbaric treatment of Allied and Soviet POWs. The soldiers fully expected this twisted mirror image of their own system. They anticipated being starved as the men at Stalingrad had been. They anticipated being worked to death in mines or factories, just as millions of slave laborers were being consumed by the German war machine. They expected summary executions for the slightest infraction. This carefully constructed narrative of fear was a cornerstone of Nazi military morale. Therefore, the reality of their arrival in the United States was not just a pleasant surprise. It was a profound ideological assault. The clean barracks, the plentiful food, the absence of casual brutality. Every aspect of their humane treatment was a direct contradiction of their indoctrination. It was a psychological shock from which many would never recover. The American guards weren't the sadistic monsters they had been promised. The local townspeople weren't spitting at them with hate. The system itself, governed by the arcane rules of the Geneva Convention, seemed almost benign. This wasn't the America they were supposed to be fighting. This cognitive dissonance created a fissure in their worldview, a crack through which the truth of their own regime's lies began to seep. The action of Klaus Richter's new life was not the thunder of artillery, but the rhythm of the seasons. The American government, in partnership with local agricultural extensions, had established a system. Farmers in need of labor would submit a request to the nearest POW camp. The government would then contract out the prisoners, transporting them each morning from the camp to the farms in canvas-covered trucks. The farmers paid the U.S. Treasury the local prevailing wage for a farmhand. From that wage, the government deducted the cost of the prisoners' food, housing, and guards. The remainder, as stipulated by the Geneva Convention, was to be paid to the prisoner himself. Klaus's first day of work was in a sugar beet field. The Iowa sun was hot, a different heat from the dry scorch of Africa. He worked alongside dozens of his comrades, thinning the beet plants under the watchful eyes of a few armed guards, who seemed more bored than menacing. The work was grueling, back-breaking labor, but it was also honest work. It was tangible. At the front, his labor had been destruction. Here it was cultivation. He was helping to grow food. The interactions with the locals were stilted at first. Many of the farmers were older men, or women and children whose husbands and fathers were fighting in Europe, perhaps even fighting against men like Klaus. There was an understandable tension, a mixture of necessity, resentment, and curiosity. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, a strange, unspoken rapport began to form. A farmer's wife might bring out a pitcher of cold lemonade on a hot afternoon, a shared nod of respect for a hard day's work. Simple human gestures bridged the vast gulf of language and war. The prisoners worked in nearly every sector of agriculture. In the South, they picked cotton. In the Midwest, they detasseled corn and harvested peas. In Wisconsin, they worked in canning factories. In the Pacific Northwest, they cut timber. They became a familiar, if strange, sight in rural America, the blue-dyed uniforms of the Wehrmacht's veterans dotting the landscape of their enemy. The physical toll was immense, but it was nothing compared to the war. Here, exhaustion was followed by a hot meal and a clean bed, not an artillery barrage. And at the end of each workday, something happened that cemented the utter strangeness of their new reality. They lined up, and an American officer would hand each of them a small paper chit, a token or a coupon. The payment was the ultimate, unexpected twist. According to the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners were to be paid for their labor at a rate not less than 8 cents per day. The U.S. government, however, decided to pay them a standard rate of 80 cents per day in the form of camp scrip. This scrip had no value outside the prison camp, but inside it was currency. Each camp had a canteen, or post-exchange, where the prisoners could spend their earnings. For Klaus, the first time he exchanged his work scrip was an out-of-body experience. He walked into the camp canteen and saw shelves stocked with items he hadn't seen in years, if ever. There were Lucky Strike and Camel cigarettes, Hershey's chocolate bars, chewing gum, Lux soap, and bottles of ice-cold Coca-Cola. He could take the paper chit he had earned for a day of hard labor in a beet field and buy a small piece of the American life he was supposed to be destroying. This small act of commerce was a more powerful weapon against his ideology than any leaflet drop or radio broadcast. Slave laborers are not paid. Subhuman enemies are not given the dignity of a transaction. The 80 cents a day fundamentally recategorized his existence. He was no longer just a captive. He was a laborer, a wage earner, a consumer. The system treated him not as a political or racial enemy, but as an economic unit within a regulated system. This policy created a bizarre microeconomy within the camps. Prisoners saved their scrip for coveted items. Some pooled their resources. Those with skills, tailors, barbers, watchmakers, could earn extra scrip by offering their services to fellow prisoners. The canteens became social hubs, places where men could smoke an American cigarette, drink a Coke, and momentarily forget they were thousands of miles from home, on the wrong side of a war they were clearly losing. The simple, mundane act of buying a bar of soap was a powerful affirmation of their humanity. It was the most unexpected outcome of all. In the heart of its enemy's homeland, the German Lanzer was being introduced to the quiet, seductive power of American capitalism. The experience was profoundly disorienting, challenging the very foundations of the soldiers' Nazi beliefs by offering not punishment, but productivity and pay. The cumulative effect of this treatment, the fair work, the good food, the clean housing, and the daily wage, was a slow-acting psychological solvent that began to dissolve years of Nazi indoctrination. The caricature of the evil, degenerate American simply could not survive the daily reality of a farmer sharing his lunch or a camp administrator ensuring their mail from home was delivered. This created a powerful cognitive dissonance in the minds of the prisoners. They had been taught to see the world in black and white, the heroic, virtuous Reich versus a coalition of demonic enemies. But their life in America was overwhelmingly gray. For many, the first casualty was their belief in German victory. From their vantage point, they saw an America that was not just undamaged by war, but was thriving. They saw the endless freight trains carrying tanks, trucks, and guns to the coasts. They saw the vast fertile farms producing a superabundance of food. They read American newspapers and magazines in the camp libraries which, though censored, still painted a picture of staggering industrial might and a confident, unified populace. They realized that Germany was not fighting a weak, decadent enemy, but a sleeping giant that was now fully awake. Hope for a German victory, already fading on the battlefields of Europe, died completely in the fields of Iowa and Texas. This realization led to a deeper questioning. If the propaganda about American weakness was a lie, what else was a lie? Many began to secretly doubt the entire Nazi project. In some camps, the U.S. military initiated a formal re-education program, subtly introducing democratic ideals through newspapers, books, and films. But the most effective re-education was the lived experience itself. The prisoners learned about democracy not from a lecture, but from the simple fairness of the system they were in. They were prisoners, yes, but they were prisoners under a system of law, not the arbitrary cruelty of a totalitarian state. The psychological effect rippled through the camps. Some ardent Nazis remained defiant, establishing secret camp Gestapos to intimidate those they saw as wavering. But for the majority, the experience was transformative. A slow, quiet, and deeply personal surrender was taking place, not a surrender of arms, which had already happened, but a surrender of the mind. They were being defeated not by force but by kindness. It was a form of psychological warfare so subtle and so powerful that neither the prisoners nor their captors fully appreciated its impact at the time. December 24, 1943, 23:45 hours. Somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. The air in the troop transport's hold is thick, a foul cocktail of sweat, diesel fumes, and vomit. For Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, the darkness is a suffocating blanket, punctuated only by the rhythmic groan of the ship's hull as it plows through the unseen waves. Just weeks ago, he was a veteran of the Africa Corps, his world defined by the bleached white sun and the endless sand of the Tunisian desert. He had known the adrenal-spiked terror of a British Crusader tank cresting a dune, the bone-rattling concussion of an 80mm gun firing beside him, and the gnawing emptiness of a canteen nearly dry. He had surrendered near Tunis, exhausted, out of ammunition, and disillusioned, his belief in a swift victory shattered by the overwhelming material power of the Allies. Now, he is just a number, one of thousands of German prisoners packed below deck, heading toward the one place his entire worldview was built to despise, America. The propaganda films of Dr. Goebbels flickered in his memory. Grotesque caricatures of American gangsters, degenerate jazz musicians, and cruel capitalists who would surely torture and starve their captives. He clutches a worn photo of his wife, Anya, her smile a painful reminder of a life that now feels like it belonged to another man. In his last letter, written from a transit camp in Oran, he had tried to be brave, assuring her he would endure whatever came. But in the crushing darkness of the Atlantic, that bravery has evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal fear. He and the others had been told nothing, a deliberate strategy to keep them disoriented. Rumors swirled in hushed German whispers. They were being taken to Canada to be worked to death in labor camps. They were being shipped to some remote island from which they would never return. The most terrifying rumor was that they would be handed over to the Soviets. Anything seemed more plausible than the truth. As the ship groans, a young soldier near Klaus begins to sob quietly, a heartbreaking sound in the oppressive gloom. Klaus says nothing. There are no words of comfort that wouldn't sound like a lie. He closes his eyes, trying to picture Anya's face, but all he sees is a terrifying, unknown future. He is no longer a soldier of the Wehrmacht. He is cargo, and he is being delivered to the enemy. He expects a nightmare. He could never imagine the reality awaiting him would be far more bewildering. By 1943, the United States had transformed into the arsenal of democracy, a vast engine of war production and agricultural output. But this transformation came at a staggering cost. Over 16 million Americans, mostly young men, were serving in the armed forces. They left behind factories, offices, and most critically, farms. The nation faced a monumental paradox. It was tasked with feeding not only its own civilian population and military, but also its allies across the globe. Yet the very hands needed to sow, tend, and harvest the crops were holding rifles thousands of miles away. The American heartland, the breadbasket of the world, was facing a catastrophic labor shortage. The government's initial solutions were patchwork. The Women's Land Army and the U.S. Crop Corps mobilized women, students, and volunteers. But their numbers were never enough to fill the void left by millions of enlisted men. Importing labor from Mexico under the Bracero program helped, particularly in the Southwest. But the problem was nationwide. From the potato fields of Maine to the cotton plantations of Mississippi and the fruit orchards of California, crops were in danger of rotting where they stood. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a strategic vulnerability. A failure to meet agricultural quotas could starve armies and cripple the Allied war effort. Simultaneously, another logistical challenge was sailing toward America's shores. Hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners of war. Following the Allied victories in North Africa in May 1943 and the subsequent campaigns in Sicily and Italy, the number of captured German and Italian soldiers swelled. Keeping them in hastily constructed camps in North Africa or a war-torn Europe was a security risk and a drain on precious Allied resources. The British, their own nation under constant threat, could not house them all. The only viable solution was to transport them across the Atlantic to the continental United States. Here, the framework for their treatment was not arbitrary. It was dictated by the 1929 Geneva Convention, of which both the United States and Germany were signatories. The treaty was meticulously detailed. It stipulated that prisoners of war must be humanely treated, adequately fed, and housed in conditions comparable to those of the detaining power's own base camp troops. Crucially, Article 27 stated that captive officers could not be forced to work, but enlisted men could be required to labor for the benefit of the detaining power, with certain restrictions. The work could not be related to war operations, it could not be unhealthy or dangerous, and the prisoners must be paid for their labor. This last point, a simple line in a lengthy treaty, would become the source of one of the most surreal and unexpected experiences of the war. Thus, two of America's biggest wartime problems, a crippling labor shortage at home and a burgeoning population of enemy prisoners abroad, were about to converge into a single, improbable solution. The journey across the Atlantic was the final, terrifying chapter of the soldiers' combat experience. But the moment Klaus Richter and his comrades disembarked at a port like Norfolk, Virginia, their reality began to warp. Herded off the ship, they were not met with the snarling dogs and brutal guards of their propaganda-fueled nightmares. Instead, they were processed with a cold, almost boring efficiency by American military police. They were deloused, given new clothing, often surplus U.S. Army fatigues dyed dark blue, with the letters PW stenciled in white on the back and legs, and given their first American meal. For men accustomed to the meager, hardtack rations of the front lines, the food was a profound shock. They were served soft white bread, real butter, meat, potatoes, and coffee with milk and sugar. It was more plentiful and of better quality than what most civilians were eating back in war-ravaged Germany. This initial act of seemingly casual generosity was deeply disorienting. It was their first clue that the world they had been told about was a lie. The true journey into the surreal began with the train ride inland. Loaded onto passenger cars, not the cattle cars they had used to transport their own prisoners across Europe, the Germans stared out the windows in disbelief. They rolled for days through a country untouched by war. There were no bombed-out buildings, no craters in the roads, no streams of desperate refugees. They saw bustling towns, vast orderly farms stretching to the horizon, and civilians who would occasionally gather at crossings, staring with more curiosity than hatred. Guards on the train were typically relaxed, some even attempting conversation. Their final destination was one of over 500 camps that had sprung up across 46 states. Klaus was sent to Camp Algona in rural Iowa. The camp was a small, self-contained city of order and cleanliness. There were wooden barracks with actual beds and mattresses, mess halls, a recreation building, a library, and even a chapel. The prisoners were organized into companies, mirroring their own military structure, with German NCOs left in charge of day-to-day discipline. The American camp commander, often a reserve officer deemed unfit for combat duty, laid out the rules, which were strict but fair, and directly aligned with the Geneva Convention. They were told they were prisoners of war, not criminals. They would be expected to work, but they would be treated with respect as long as they followed the regulations. To Klaus and the others, this was incomprehensible. Where was the hatred? Where was the cruelty? This wasn't a prison. It was more like a strange regimented boarding school. The initial fear began to curdle into a profound and unsettling confusion. To understand the prisoners' shock, one must understand the world Dr. Goebbels had built for them. Nazi propaganda was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, designed to create a hermetically sealed reality. The average German soldier was fed a relentless diet of ideology that portrayed the enemy in monstrous terms. The Soviets were depicted as subhuman Bolshevik barbarians, a tide of Asiatic destruction that had to be stopped at all costs. The British were arrogant, declining imperialists, but the Americans were portrayed with a unique blend of contempt and fear. The prisoner of war labor program was an unqualified success for the American war effort. Between 1943 and 1945, German and Italian POWs provided an estimated 10 million man-days of labor in agriculture alone, saving countless harvests that would have otherwise rotted. They helped the United States meet its immense obligation to feed itself in the free world, forming a critical, if often overlooked, component of the Allied victory. The program was a testament to American pragmatism, turning a logistical burden into a strategic asset. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the work did not stop. The prisoners remained in the United States for many months, some until mid-1946, continuing to work on the farms while awaiting repatriation to a continent in ruins. For many, the news from home was devastating. They learned of the full extent of the Holocaust, the destruction of their cities, and the division of their country. The return home was another profound shock. They left a land of plenty and arrived in a landscape of starvation and rubble. Klaus Richter returned to a Hamburg that was little more than a pile of bricks. He found his wife Anya alive but gaunt, living in a cellar. He returned with a unique perspective. While his neighbors harbored a mix of resentment, denial, and confusion, Klaus carried with him the memory of a different world. He had seen his enemy up close and discovered they were not monsters. He had been treated with a dignity he did not expect, and it had changed him forever. Tens of thousands of German veterans shared this experience. They returned to Germany not with hatred for America, but often with a quiet admiration. They had witnessed the power of its industry, the vastness of its resources, and the fundamental fairness of its system, even in its treatment of a captured enemy. In the post-war years, as Germany was being rebuilt and the Cold War was beginning, these former POWs became an unintentional but powerful pro-American, pro-democratic bloc within German society. They were the farmers, the factory workers, and the citizens who understood that the caricature of America they had been fed was a lie. The story of the paid German POWs in America remains a remarkable, lesser-known chapter of the Second World War. It is a story where the rules of war were followed with unexpected consequences. It demonstrates that the most effective weapon is not always a bomb or a bullet, but sometimes an act of humanity. It was a strange and quiet conflict, fought not in trenches, but in cotton fields and canning factories, where the act of paying an enemy 80 cents for a day's work did more to defeat an ideology than an army ever could.